think of how hard it is for cardiologists to admit that the gut microbiome has an influence on your heart, that your oral microbiome, that microbes, bugs in your mouth could affect your risk of a heart attack. Imagine that. If a patient comes to see you and is concerned about whether they might have a heart attack, maybe you should do an oral exam.
Dr. Robert Rountree is a leading expert in integrative and personalized medicine, currently serving as the medical director of Boulder WellCare in Colorado. Dr. Rountree has been practicing family medicine since 1983 and was an early pioneer in holistic healthcare, co-founding one of the first multidisciplinary clinics in the U.S. A longtime clinical editor for integrative and complementary therapies, Dr. Rountree has co-authored several books on integrative and nutritional medicine, including the textbook of functional medicine. He's a core faculty member at the Institute for Functional Medicine and a recipient of the Linus Pauling Functional Medicine Award. All right, well, welcome back to Take Back Your Health with Dr. Amy Myers. Today's guest is a long-term colleague, Dr. Robert Rountree. Welcome. So happy to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here. And you can call me Bob.
Oh, my God. I finally get to call you Bob after all these years.
Bob
Dr. Bob.
Bobby.
I never liked the doctor first name.
Yeah,
people always, so we'll go with Bob if I can.
Yeah.
I definitely am of the upbringing of respecting your elders. And
we're Southerners, right?
Yes. So, I might have to stick with Dr. Rountree,
right.
but we've known each other for a very long time. You were one of the pioneers in functional medicine and, on the faculty for the Institute for Functional Medicine. So learned a lot about you. And today we're going to be talking about the immune system, autoimmunity, sort of, how we end up in this boat, and a little bit about some mushrooms and botanicals and things that we can do to help with the immune system. So I like to just kind of start with how you got into all of this. What's your story?
Well, how far back do you want to go?
My guess is that you started in, conventional medicine, because when you were starting, there wasn't something, at least with the name of functional medicine.
Yeah, actually, it's the other way around.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay.
I grew up eating crap food in South Alabama, right? And I still like grits and I still eat grits, but, red-eye gravy and, all that stuff. Turns out that cow peas, which we call black-eyed peas, turns out they're actually pretty good for you. But, back then we had them with grease on them and, bacon, green,
and the lard
and stuff, all that stuff. So I didn't know anything about food or eating. And then I went off to college, and my freshman year, I got introduced to other ideas about eating, vegetarianism, which I said, well, that's kind of a cool idea. I just never thought about it. And then somebody handed me this book called Herbs, the Magic Healers by a guy named Paul Twitchell. And I just never thought about that stuff, but I read the book and I went, holy cow, there's this whole realm of science out there. So I got into herbal medicine. I was 19.
Wow.
So I started going to health food stores and hanging out and learning about herbs and,
What part of the country were you living in at the time?
North Carolina.
Oh, really? Okay.
I was in North Carolina. And, there was this burgeoning movement towards natural medicine. And I got really into it. But then I began to realize that there wasn't much of a career path if I wanted to do it. And there was always a chance of getting arrested. So, practicing medicine without a license. So I thought, well, I need that license. And then I decided to go to medical school, applied to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, got into it. And then I thought, well, now what am I going to do, right? Because I'm surrounded by all these people that had been thinking about medicine their whole life. And, I was more interested in natural healing and that sort of thing. So there were some philosophical clashes, but at the same time, when I started studying advanced biology and biochemistry and physiology, I thought, well, there's something to this. Mm-hmm. And that was the big surprise for me, is I hadn't expected to love the science as much as I did. Mm-hmm. So, that ended up becoming what we call integrative medicine today, which is saying, let's use the best of science, but let's also use what has historically been shown to be beneficial.
Right.
And that was before functional medicine existed. So I got into practice in Boulder, Colorado, which is a pretty progressive kind of place. There were herbalists everywhere, nutritionists everywhere. And then somewhere along the line, I met Dr. Jeffrey Bland.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
started going to his seminars, thought that was great stuff. And then at some point, I couldn't tell you the exact year, they started the training that became the applied functional medicine and clinical practice. And they asked me to come out and do the very first one.
Wow. Amazing.
And asked me to speak on inflammation. And, I knew a little bit about it. I knew about herbal inflammatories like turmeric and ginger and things like that. So I said, sure, I'll do it. And that began this many decade-long deep dive into understanding the physiology of immunity, how the immune system works. So again, it's just been year after year after year of getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it.
Right. And for those who are listening, if you haven't listened, there is an interview already with Dr. Jeffrey Bland, who we used to call him the father of functional medicine, but I think we can call him the granddad
of functional medicine.
The granddad of functional medicine. So I guess it was the science that really propelled you in medical school. I mean, I too went into medical school knowing that I wanted to do something other than conventional medicine. I just didn't know what it was. And so I found, going through medical school and particularly residency, very draining because of some of this stuff that I was learning, knowing that I felt differently about it. I thought differently about it, and I would probably never use it. Did you, have those times as well?
I saw things that I wish I hadn't seen.
Yeah.
People being treated in a not respectful way, especially cancer patients.
Mm-hmm.
I trained in Hershey, PA. It's a tertiary care center. It's a great hospital and a lovely location surrounded by farmland. But the oncology of this practice there was very, very conventional. There was no belief whatsoever in the role of nutrition, lifestyle, your mindset, anything like that. And I actually saw people being treated against their will. People with terminal cancers that were told, well, you've got to do chemotherapy on their deathbed.
Yeah.
And it just disturbed me to no end.
My mother had died of pancreatic cancer after being diagnosed 4 months previously, right before I went to medical school. And so I had that experience of just seeing, honestly, I think if she'd done nothing, she would have lived longer. And the chemotherapy just really, hit her immune system so hard that I think she, frankly, was killed much more quickly. And there's just no talk of, quality of life over quantity of life, or at least there wasn't at that point.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I think so many patients have come in and said, you can't do anything for the nausea I'm getting from the chemo or my hair loss or my intestinal symptoms I'm getting from the chemo. I think so many patients have complained that a lot of oncologists are, at least acknowledging, well, maybe it'll be helpful for you to get a little acupuncture.
Right. Well, I don't know. You and I were just discussing my half sister right before this, who's 31 with stage 4 breast cancer. And, conventional medicine has this one, gene SNP inhibitor for her. But other than that, it's only something to potentially prolong her life, but certainly not save it.
Yeah.
So she finally called me and we are starting to do a lot more. I mean, I don't even want to call it alternative or even complementary. Right. I mean, it's kind of like, why isn't it, these are all the things that will help you, natural agents to conventional agents to hyperbarics, IVs, things like that. Anyway, I mean, literally her oncologist said to her, if you go do that, you're basically going to die.
Yeah.
And it's just like, how can that
be, right? It's
how can that be?
The outcome.
Right.
We're focused on the procedure. This is what's accepted. This is what we do. And, if you don't do it, you're condemned. It just doesn't make any sense. So
yes.
And I've seen too many people that did things that I didn't think it was going to help, and then they got dramatically better. So, there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy. So I think we have to accept that the stuff about the body we don't all understand.
Absolutely.
And every individual's got their own healing path.
Right. And, just because, more just, if it's not doing harm, why not try it?
Why not try it?
Yeah. Yeah. But I guess even like hyperbarics, it's some word on the street with the oncologist that it can spread your cancer instead of like, okay, well, cancer is living in an anaerobic environment. And when you add, oxygen to it, it actually kills the cancer.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, but this does have to do with the immune system, right?
Yep.
I think we can talk about, I think we were going to spend our time on autoimmunity, but really, I think a lot of people are saying, I interviewed Dr. Alessio Fasano probably 10 years ago, and then again recently. And, back when I interviewed him initially, he was saying, we knew that this 3-prong approach and leaky gut was contributing and a factor in autoimmunity. And it was a theory that it was there with cancer previously.
Mm-hmm.
And now 10 years later, as I interviewed him, he said, no, this is no longer theoretical. This certainly, it's the same sort of cascade. So I think we can agree at this point, or many of us on this side of the fence can agree that this inflammation or this chronic inflammation is really this precursor to virtually all chronic diseases.
Yeah.
Yes. So why don't you, kind of talk, can you just give us a basic working definition of inflammation and maybe acute versus chronic and what you're seeing?
Hey, where do we start with that one? Inflammation is really it's probably the oldest known described medical phenomena in history. There's writings back from Egyptian times, from the Egyptian physicians thousands of years ago that basically describe what we know as inflammation, which is redness, swelling, heat, and pain, and then later was added to that loss of function. So that understanding of the phenomenon has been around for a long time. What is fairly new is understanding that the same thing you see when somebody gets a cut or steps on a thorn and you get redness, swelling, heat, and pain is really the same kind of process that goes on with Alzheimer's disease or heart disease. Now, Rudolf Virchow, the German pathologist, proposed, 150 some years ago, that heart disease was caused by inflammation, not cholesterol.
Now, why can't we get the cardiologists? Still, really.
Some of them get it. Most of them still think that atherosclerosis is a lipid storage disorder. Right. And even though the data clearly show that statins work by lowering inflammation rather than getting rid of the cholesterol, they still don't quite understand it. And I still order highly sensitive C-reactive protein as a screening test on my patients. C-reactive protein is a fundamental marker of an inflammatory process. And I get rejections from Medicare saying this is an experimental test, which is nuts. It's just nuts. It's not based on the literature. It's who knows, who made that decision? I don't know, but it's not based on the science. And typically the science is about 15 years ahead of clinical practice.
Yes, 10 to 15. But we've been talking about this for well over that.
Yeah, many decades.
Yes.
Yeah. And
leaky gut, I understand. We were talking about that 10,
40
15
years ago, Leo Gallen was talking about leaky gut.
Well, okay. Well, there you go. But the rest of functional medicine started talking about it, 15 years ago. And now, conventional medicine is slowly catching up. But with heart disease, it really doesn't seem like it is in some cases.
Well, think of how hard it is for cardiologists to admit that the gut microbiome has an influence on your heart, that your oral microbiome, that microbes, bugs in your mouth could affect your risk of a heart attack. Imagine that, if a patient comes to see you and is concerned about whether they might have a heart attack, maybe you should do an oral exam.
Right.
What a concept.
And not get your teeth cleaned right before you think you're going to have a heart attack.
That's pretty wise to do that. So inflammation is the body's normal physiologic response to a traumatic event, right? And classically, we would have thought that traumatic event is going to be some kind of physical injury, a cut, a laceration, stepping on a thorn, as I mentioned. But now we've begun to realize that those triggers for that normal physiologic event actually can include things like toxic chemicals in our environment.
Mm-hmm.
That arsenic, which is widespread in our water supply, could cause problems. That mercury could cause problems, and that can lead to autoimmunity because once you set inflammation in motion, then the problem is it doesn't always turn off. So in a natural, healthy system, if you get a cut, your immune system responds appropriately. So that redness and swelling and pain and heat and all that stuff just means that the immune system is doing what it's genetically programmed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Right.
And then it turns off. It's supposed to turn off. So as soon as it gets turned on, there's processes that immediately begin to turn the off switch. What if you don't turn that switch off? And who's set up for not having the switch turned off? Well, people that eat an inflammatory diet. What a concept, a pro-inflammatory diet, right? Which is actually in the literature now. We've all been talking about it for decades, but now there are multiple published studies that show that there's a diet that sets you up for not being able to turn off acute inflammation so it becomes chronic. Hence, Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, metabolic syndrome, fatty liver, you name it.
So let's talk about that because, that's a very broad statement. And even amongst the two of us, that might, there might be some nuances that are different. So I think we can all agree high sugar, high carb, high processed foods would be, basically the standard American diet is this diet you're referring to. Is it as simple as that? Or are we getting into, does that include meat? Does it not include meat? If it includes meat, is it pasture raised, grass fed or not? Where do you fall on this dietary? You mentioned, can't remember now if it was pre-taping the show or not, about being a vegetarian. At one point, I was a vegetarian for 27 years. So what spectrum are we talking about with this pro-inflammatory diet? Is it more than just...
I think probably the number one issue is how processed is the food, right? So it's less about vegetarian or not vegetarian, but more about how is the food processed? Where did it come from? How was the cow raised? We can talk about fish. Okay, fish is anti-inflammatory, isn't it? Well, where did that fish come from? Is it farmed fish? And in the future, most fish is going to be farmed, right? We can't get away from that. But there's different ways of doing that aquaculture.
Right.
Right. So the processing is a big deal. In my lectures to both the public and the doctors, I talk a lot about sticky buns, right? Sticky bun, donuts and, Cinnabons and things like that. Like, what is it that's so harmful about those foods? Well, there's two major things. One is that refined carbohydrates, processed foods are very high in something that we call PAMPs, pathogen-associated molecular patterns. And that's now kind of been refined a little bit to say microbe-associated molecular patterns. Wait a minute, how can a donut have a microbe-associated molecular pattern? Well, to understand that, you've got to know how the innate immune system works and what's the difference in the innate and acquired immune system. Okay, so very short answer. The innate immune system is the ancient immune system. I mean, you find it in jellyfish, right? So the innate immune system is genetically programmed to identify a strange molecule versus a molecule that's part of self versus non-self. And the way it does that is with receptors, which is basically the lock on your door, right? And so the key to opening the lock is a molecular pattern. So a pathogen-associated molecular pattern, microbe-associated molecular pattern. Those are called motifs, right? So what's a motif? In Beethoven, ba-ba-ba-bum, that's a motif, right? But nature has designed these receptors so that they can recognize a pattern. And when they see that pattern, they go, something's wrong. Something is different here. Now, that's not enough. So that's a stranger. It's got to be a dangerous stranger to set things off. So if your immune cells come in contact with the molecular patterns that are found in a donut, in a sticky bun, they get activated. They wake up. And before that, they're mostly dormant. Polly Matzinger, the famous immunologist at NIH, he says they're sleeping. Your immune cells are sleeping most of the time, but they're tracking what's going by, right? I noticed that molecule, that molecule. Well, this is exactly the same thing that happens when you go on a picnic and you get out the chicken and suddenly there are wasps everywhere. How did the wasp know that you had that chicken sandwich? Because they can detect the molecules of that chicken that wafted into the air. They can detect those molecules a mile away, and they can be there in minutes. So your immune cells are the same thing. When you eat, you don't eat, but when somebody eats the donut, the sticky bun, our immune cells immediately start recognizing there's a foreign pattern, and they start to wake up.
And is that because there's gluten and we've hybridized the gluten? Is that because there's, canola oil or, food dyes, all of it above? Did our immune system with our ancestors, they didn't have a donut, but let's take something like a dinner roll that, at least, my great-grandmother who died at 103, we had Sunday dinner after church and there were dinner rolls. I grew up in New Orleans. My grandfather owned a bakery, Bacher's Bakery. So there was French bread. So let's use French bread that has been there for the last 100 years or more. Was that happening then, or is this more a result of us having, changed our food supply so significantly?
Okay, so I've been talking about innate immune cells, right, which is the pre-programmed part of our immune system. And those innate immune cells can be more or less trigger happy, right? If those innate immune cells have been depleted of certain chemicals that have been in our diet for many, many thousands of years, beneficial phytochemicals, olive oil, polyphenols, right? The things that provide color to blueberries, squash, etc., which are quite familiar with. What that does, and I'll use the technical term, which is that it affects the redox balance inside of the cells. What that means for listeners that aren't familiar with the biochemistry is it affects the balance between oxidants and antioxidants. And so if there is an extremely imbalanced internal cellular situation, then our immune cells are much more prone to overreacting to that French bread, right? So there's two things that are going on. The French bread that we eat now is really different than the French bread that people ate 100 years ago because of hybridization, and also because there are other substances in there, right, that kind of go hand in hand with creating this inflammatory response. But clearly, the kind of bread you get in Paris and, in the bistros and the little corner shops, I was amazed the last time I was in Paris and was just looking at what every little neighborhood can buy. I'm like, I like that bread. It looks
real.
It looks real. It's just grainy and coarse. And, it's a really different kind of thing than what most people are eating here today. So that creates what we call in functional medicine an antecedent. Antecedent means we're set up with our modern immune systems eating those kind of foods to overreact to what should be an okay trigger.
Right. And so that is because we have altered our food supply, but also because, we're being exposed to more toxins than ever before. We're born by C-section and not getting, a proper gut microbiome. We're getting bombarded with antibiotics, other toxins. And so it kind of ends up being this perfect storm. Is that,
when I lecture on the toxins, I say, well, I go by he, him, but I'm also going by Dr. Doom, because if you hear everything I have to say, You're not going to want to eat anything, touch anything, drink any water, because it is getting to a point in our society where it's kind of scary to think about it. And what it means is that we have to be conscious of what we're drinking and what we're eating, because it does make a huge difference.
And I mean, really, it is. And I tell people, I try to give them enough information and then give them a solution, right? And I say, I've built this very sophisticated house in Santa Fe that has no wood, so we wouldn't have mold. And, the Wi-Fi can't get through because it's steel and pumice-crete. But, and we have a whole house water filter. But, I say, filter your water at home, filter your air at home, turn off your routers whenever you can. And then, when you go out, make obviously, and eat organic in your house. And then when you go out, make the best choices you can. So why don't we move on to some solutions? Because this is something that, I know a lot of solutions, but I want to get into some of the mushrooms and the extracts and the botanicals, because in general, many of the people that came to see me had candida.
Yep.
And so I would often recommend no mushrooms. But I mean, if you look out at the world today and you walk in the health food store, the grocery store, mushrooms, mushroom extracts, coffees, teas, I mean, they're everywhere. So I would love to spend a little time being educated, frankly, because I've shied away from the mushrooms with all the people in my practice with candida and, cross-reactivity with fungi.
Yeah.
So where shall we start there?
Okay. So I got to go on record as saying I love medicinal fungi.
Okay.
Right? And the best book you can ever read on the potential benefits of fungi is by Merlin Sheldrake, called Entangled Life. And it will change your whole perspective on the role that beneficial fungi, or fungi, I like to say fungi, right?
Right.
That the role that they have to play in our life. So here's a basic concept. We can train our immune system. Again, we have this innate immune system, which has got a built-in genetic program to react to certain molecular structures that are clearly different from self, right? So, and living creatures don't have those molecular structures. So, animals don't have that molecular structure. Now, let's segue from that to a concept that was developed in Europe many years ago, which is vaccination to prevent TB. And the vaccination was with a kind of killed bacteria called BCG.
Mm-hmm.
Bacille calmette-guerin, I think, something like that. Okay. We don't get that in the US, but it's kind of standard practice in Europe. And how does it work? It trains the innate immune system. Now, that is a powerful concept because, in general, vaccines work on the acquired immune system, right? The person gets a tetanus shot or a measles shot, that's activating T cells and B cells, and you make antibodies, that. So the distinguishing point between innate and acquired immunity is the response to vaccines, but BCG is different. So BCG trains the innate immune system. And what I mean by training it is that it primes those sleeping immune cells so that they're on alert, right? They're just on alert. They're not in active inflammation mode. They're on alert, which means that they pay attention. So if the person gets exposed to TB, they're more likely to fight it off. So why talk about that when we're talking about medicinal fungi? Well, I don't know how many years it's been now, but maybe the last 10, 15 years, it was discovered that a substance called beta-glucan does almost the same thing as BCG vaccine. And that is a wow. So beta-glucan is a glucose polymer. Well, that sounds technical. Polymer just means you've got a bunch of glucose molecules stuck together. And the way you stick those glucose molecules together makes all the difference. So certain ways that you stick them together create just enough of a resemblance to the key that goes in the lock of the receptors on the innate immune cells that it wakes them up without fully activating the whole inflammatory response. Make sense?
Yes, but a couple of questions. What is it waking it up to with the with the vaccine, it's waking it up to tuberculosis very specifically, right?
More
So when you're-
general than that. It's not
really?
just the TB.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
when we talk about the sleeping immune cells, so let's pick two examples: macrophages and dendritic cells.
Mhm.
So they're the cells. They're dedicated sentinels. And if a person has got gluten sensitivity and they eat gluten, their dendritic cells go wild, right? They eat the gluten, and boom, dendritic cells are saying, hey, massive alert, everybody, bring out all the guns. We've got a problem here, right? But it's a multi-step process. So even if a person's got the genes for celiac disease, maybe in the early years they can eat gluten and they don't have a problem. So what woke up the immune cells? It appears to be a multi-step process, right? So there's number one step is activating immune cells. And then number two is turning them on full blast. And then there's a number three and a number four. And so the beta-glucan appears to be the first step in the process, which is just activating certain genes. Now, in a test tube, what you see with those immune cells is they start to make chemicals called pro-inflammatory cytokines. And people used to say, well, that's a bad thing, except that there are many, many studies now, clinical studies, giving beta-glucans to people, purified beta-glucans that were made from yeast. Why do you use yeast? Because yeast, and we're not talking about candida, we're talking about Saccharomyces cerevisiae, used to make beer and bread. And then there's actually a subtype called Saccharomyces boulardii. And they have actually used special extraction techniques to make the beta-glucans pure that are from that brewer's yeast, right? And then give it to people in a capsule form. And they find that it, again, activates the innate immune system in a very specific way, but in a way that makes the person more resistant to a wide range of infections.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there.
They call
and
that
so many
trained
questions.
immunity, just the big umbrella. That's called trained immunity.
So S. Boulardii, back in the day when I was doing my training, it was like give S. Boulardii for those who have yeast. And I found in my clinical practice, it was about 50-50, people who took S. Boulardii and had candida or yeast overgrowth. Some did really well with it and it helped, and other people got worse with it. It was like a cross-reactivity something. So that's my first question is, what are your thoughts on that and what have you seen? And then I want to sort of extrapolate out S. Boulardii or suss it out from extracts of mushrooms.
Yeah. So I mostly use S. Boulardii in people that are having to take antibiotics for whatever reason. And I get a lot of calls from folks that say, hey, I went to my dentist and I've got an abscess and I've got to go on amoxicillin. And the dentist said, don't worry about your gut. And we all know that they should worry about their gut. What should I take? And that's really my probiotic of choice because it's a yeast, right? So it doesn't get affected by any antibiotic that a person gets put on. So it's well tolerated. So I've used it a lot in that scenario. Now, the kind of beta-glucans I'm talking about that people use for medicinal purposes are more purified, and I hardly ever see cross-reactivity to that.
Got it.
Why is that? Well, probably because there's a lot of complicated molecular structures involved in the S. Boulardii, right? Whereas when you purify it down and you've just got this long chain of glucose polymers, it's a little bit different. And again, that's been studied over and over again. That's kind of the first step, but let me just stick in one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
People have been eating medicinal mushrooms that have beta-glucans in them for centuries.
Right. So how are the beta-glucans that are in S. Boulardii different than what you're getting in turkey tail or a shiitake mushroom? It's more purified, but is the end result, if you purified it from turkey tail or a shiitake mushroom and you purified it from S. Boulardii, are they the same?
They all have glucose and they're all polymers. And the linkages between the glucose varies. And then there's what's called side chains. So here's where it gets fascinating is they're three-dimensional structures.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just this chain of glucose molecules, they're triple helixes.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that there's more receptor. There's not just one beta glucan receptor. There's a whole family of receptors, and we're just starting to understand all of them. So every one of those mushrooms, the turkey tail, the reishi, the maitake, the shiitake, every one of them has a slightly different effect.
Right. So then they're waking up your immune system in different ways,
Yes.
because there seems to be, at least, I don't know how much is advertising versus how much is studied. I mean, this is truly something that I don't know much about. So I'm excited that we're talking about it. Some seem to be like, oh, this one's for cancer, or this one's for autoimmunity, or this one is for, they're starting to at least market that they are for different aspects of your immune system. Is that what the research is also showing and what you're finding?
Yeah, but is the distinction really that clear? It's not at all.
No.
And I mean, I've been going back and forth in this situation for decades, really, and asking the people that make the mushrooms, why this particular one. So I think his first name is pronounced Hiroaki Nanba. Dr. Nanba is the guy that did the special maitake mushroom extract, and they market it for breast cancer. So does that mean that maitake is better for breast cancer than shiitake? Well, no, it's just that particular extract was studied, right? And it's not that different than what's done in mainstream pharmacology.
Right.
Is you go, well, why is this indicated for this scenario? You look at, say, antidepressants. Well, why is this antidepressant marketed for a person with hypersomnia and this one with insomnia, right? It's a marketing kind of thing. It doesn't mean there's not something to it, but it's more that in mainstream medicine, we like to see research,
right,
and we don't like to extrapolate.
Right.
So we don't like to hear that, all these mushrooms are potentially beneficial. It's more that if you look at cancer research, Coriolis versicolor, Tramit, now called Tramites, versicolor, those mushrooms have really been studied more for cancer and used a lot in Japan and China.
And so when, I don't know if I'm imagining you use mushrooms in your practice because you're still in practice. And so are there certain ones that you are using more than others that you've seen as more beneficial? Is it better to be getting like a blend? And if so, which mushrooms?
Yeah. So that's probably a 2-hour discussion.
Okay.
And I was actually just lecturing on this very thing in Ireland too. And, they have a lot of awareness over there about this. So to a group of nutritionists asking the same exact question. So probably the number one question is, are you better off using a single mushroom versus a blend? I think for a healthy person, a blend is better. So for general immune support, I've leaned more towards using a blend that has, say, 5 different common mushrooms in it, because I think they all do something slightly different. Right?
And is this something you recommend if you're a healthy person taking daily? Is this something you should take just during flu season? Is this something you need to take for like 5 days on, 2 days off, 1 month or 2 months on, 1 month off?
Yeah, I've been hearing that for a long time. In China, they eat mushrooms, right?
I do eat a lot of mushrooms now.
Yeah, honey. I eat shiitake, 3 times a week.
Luckily, I got a 7-year-old who loves mushrooms.
Yeah, so it should be part of your diet. I had, last night, I had Chilean sea bass with noodles and shiitake, right? I mean, this is something I eat all the time, and that's what I highly recommend. Shiitake, to me, is the tastiest of all the mushrooms, but there are a lot of other good ones out there. I mean, if you are into preparation, there's lion's mane and trumpet mushroom and oyster mushroom. So the first rule is to eat as many of the ones that you like as you can. And then the second one is, if you're healthy, I still think taking a supplement that's got a blend is good. Past that, it's really individualized for a patient. So, for example, if I've got a patient that's feeling run down, they need adrenal support, maybe lung support or kidney support, then I use cordyceps. So cordyceps used to be called caterpillar fungus, right? And
Oh, I think cordyceps sounds a little better for most
sounds
people.
better. It's, an ancient remedy in China. They used to get it in the high Himalayan mountains, and they would harvest it in the spring because it sprouted up. It looked like a plant. They thought it was magic. I was in Shanghai a few years ago and went into a store that only sold medicinal mushrooms. And they had these examples of cordyceps that were thousands of dollars.
Wow.
So you see a little box under the locked counter of a cordyceps, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's freaky looking, right? With all these arms and everything, $5,000 for one specimen. So the ones that are grown in the wild are highly prized, but now it's mostly grown in a vat. And that gives it more control. And what's so great about cordyceps? Well, it contains the immune-regulating beta-glucans, but it also has other things in it, a whole range of chemicals, I can't even name all of them, that have been shown to help with lung support, adrenal support, kidney support. There's studies on cordyceps extract for autoimmune glomerulonephritis, for example. It's one of the few natural products I know that's got data on it for that purpose. So that's how I start to tailor things. Probably the next one up that I use a lot is reishi mushroom. The elixir of immortality, it's called in Chinese medicine. So it's good for stamina. The Chinese give it to people who go up to high altitude to help them tolerate altitude better. There's data on it for chronic inflammation, for asthma. So that would be another option. I mentioned maitake, that's been used a lot for breast cancer. I mentioned the Coriolis or termites, that's used a lot for cancer. So that's another option. So again, every individual is slightly different.
And what about turkey tail? Because you see a lot of that out on the
Coriolis
market
is a
that's
Coriolis. So
okay,
it's a great looking mushroom. And my lectures, I have an actual picture of a turkey tail. So I show the turkey tail, and then the next slide, there's the Coriolis. It's like, oh, it really does look like that.
Now, is there any downside to, is there any downside in, let's just say somebody's combining these mushroom extracts themselves in terms of pills, taking different brands or different ones? Is there any downside? Can you overdo it?
Well, it's hard to overdo it because you have to eat quite a bit of,
Well, of eating, of course. Yeah. No, I mean, if you're taking
even
supplementation.
in a capsule, you'd have to take 30 grams of powder, many tablespoons, several cups. I've never had anybody eat too much of them. Have I seen serious reactions to it? I really can't think of anybody that I've had over the last 40 years of giving these to people. Some people tell me in the beginning, I don't tolerate mushrooms. So I don't recommend them to those people. It's really that simple. I mean, I do screening. You ask people, do you have issues, allergic reactions or mold intolerance, things like that? You've got to screen those people out. Right?
So,
no surprise reactions.
Right. But what about, I was seeing lots of people with, I have pretty extreme mold sensitivity. I seem to tolerate mushrooms just fine. But, what do you say either to those practitioners listening or to patients that maybe do, find themselves that they've recovered from mold illness or candida? Is this a no for them, or really just try it, see how they tolerate it?
No, it's a proceed with caution.
Right.
It's the same thing as patients that have multiple chemical sensitivity that tell me, I can't take anything. Well, I want you to do a dose of glutathione, right? This is where we're going to start. So if I think the person may benefit from it, again, it's a little bit like a natural alternative to vaccination, right? And so the whole idea is, can I build your tolerance? Now, why do we have so much mold sensitivity in our society? There's something called the hygiene hypothesis, which all about. Dr. Strawn said, well, people that grow up on farms, or people that have lots of pets when they're young, where the dog was licking the infant's face, or they have multiple siblings where people weren't that careful and cautious, actually have less autoimmune disease and less allergy. So, the whole idea that in the first year of life, your exposure to these things, your gut microbiome, your skin microbiome, all of those things are going to determine your immune tolerance. And so I think that you can actually restore immune tolerance if you do that correctly. I've actually seen it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I 100% agree with all of that. And we have these horrible hurricanes, wreaking havoc,
Oh
and
my
people
God.
are not fixing their houses properly. Whether we won't get into the reasons why, at least in Texas, they're building things so quickly and it's pouring down rain and then they close them up. And
Really find out the house is built on an old lake that was drained and
right. I mean, it just, I do believe that more and more is contributing to that, situation than we had previously had just thought.
the body's getting overwhelmed with the exposure. And you're right. If you're in a water damaged building, and you don't, especially if you don't realize that the building's been damaged, you got a leak behind your water heater, or the area flooded and you thought it dried out and you're fine. Again, I think there's a way to rebuild immune tolerance. And that, to me, is the top strategy I use for autoimmune disease, to say, your immune system has become intolerant. And let's come at it different ways. So something like low-dose naltrexone can do the same thing. It's another angle, but the goal we're aiming towards is to restore tolerance and to restore barriers. So they both go together.
And I know that mostly you are helping to educate practitioners. Is there a resource that you have on your website or a place that you could direct people who want to learn more about mushrooms?
Well, I think there's some really good...
We definitely want to learn more about you, and we will get to that if that's what the smile is for. We definitely want to do that, but
my smile
mushrooms
is that
first.
I'm an old timer. I don't have a website.
I know.
I have
you
actually.
don't have a website. Okay.
I've started down that path many times, but I've been too busy.
Hey, if you don't need one,
Yeah,
really, why would you have one?
I'm not sure. I would know what
or another book, even someone else's resource. If someone just wants to learn more about mushrooms.
Well, go to the companies that make them. Paul Stamets has really produced a lot of information on this stuff. What's his company called? Fungi Perfecti or something like that. And then there's another website, Real Mushrooms, is a company that I think is very reputable. For your European listeners, the company I like is Hifastatera, is Hifasdaterra. I've actually done some lecturing for them, and they work with oncologists in Europe.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're doing really sophisticated research. Go to China and you learn a lot there. I was in Beijing a few years ago, and there was a restaurant in our hotel that had mushroom extracts in every product. Not extracts, they had, full-blown mushrooms, and there were just things in there where you go, wow. So the Chinese have been at this for thousands of years.
Thousands of years, yeah. And anything when we're looking at, besides, obviously, I would imagine the fundamental basic is certified organic. Anything else to, when you're looking to buy mushrooms, whether to eat or extracts, that someone should be
you want to go
with
a really reputable, well-known company. I hate to say it, but I've consulted for a number of supplement companies over the years, and what I found is the problems they run into with sourcing materials. Right? Is they say, okay, I want to do a mushroom extract, and so they'll ask companies to send the raw material, and some of it doesn't even have mushroom in it. It's just sawdust.
Right. So obviously third-party testing. Yeah. Third-party
testing. It's got to be verified. Clean products, not additives, et cetera. All that stuff is really important.
Okay. And I know you did not want to talk about vaccines. And so if you don't want to answer this question, you don't have to. But why are more vaccines not like the tuberculosis vaccine, where it's just, trying to wake up the immune system?
There are people, there is a faction of of vaccinologists. So there's, whole subspecialty vaccinologists that are saying we should come up with a more universal vaccine. It's not really specific. It's not just mRNA for a particular virus, et cetera, but there are vaccines in development that just not getting a lot of attention, right? So it's happening in the background, but the idea is our immune systems are weak right now. As you mentioned, we have more exposure to mold and toxins and processed foods. So our immune systems really need help. Like this whole hygiene hypothesis is just getting worse as, we put antibacterial compounds in steering wheels of cars and, baby bottles and things like that. It's like triclosan everywhere. That's creating immune systems that are really trigger happy.
Yeah.
And
my daughter got
do something.
My daughter got home from horseback riding yesterday and didn't wash her hands, didn't change her clothes. I got the smell of a horse all over my house. Eventually, I did make her wash her hands before we ate dinner. But, she comes home and, we just let that horse stuff get everywhere.
Yeah. And is that good or bad? Well, it is a kind of vaccination. And some people would say, Bob, why are you even talking about something by injection? Because maybe we should be doing more research on things like the beta-glucans to say, well, what can we take that's simple and safe and readily available that will help bolster our overall immune response? So I believe in a concept called immunoplasticity. It's a kind of word that I've been using. We know about neuroplasticity.
Right. Yeah.
But immunoplasticity says you're not stuck with the immune system you've got. Right?
I like it.
There are things you can do with your immune system to make it healthier. Now, when the COVID pandemic
virus
first started, before there were vaccines, there was a lot of stuff being said about not to take this herb or that herb because it can cause a cytokine response. That turned out to be nonsense. Right? Don't take astragalus because that will make your immune system overreactive and you'll have a cytokine storm and you'll die from the elderberry. You'll die from the astragalus. It never happened, right?
Right.
They were telling people, don't take these medicinal mushrooms. Don't eat shiitake because your immune system will overreact. It doesn't happen. Did I get a little animated when I said that? Right.
Yeah, I know, but why? I mean,
I got it. Signal one. So if your macrophages, dendritic cells, or neutrophils, they need several signals to get activated. That's signal one. Right? And they've actually done studies of people in sepsis. I think there was one study done in Brazil. They gave beta-glucans IV to people in sepsis and actually helped them get over the sepsis better. So clearly there's more going on here than meets the eye. There's something we don't fully understand. And I think what we don't understand is that our bodies have been exposed to beta-glucans for a long time, right? These things have been a part of our diet for a long, long time. They're in oats, they're in barley, they're in lots of foods. So remember James Duke, bless his soul, amazing herbalist. So he said, well, why is it that the chemicals that are in plants, the phytochemicals, are so much better tolerated? The ones that we use, as medicinal foods, et cetera, something like astragalus. Why is that different than the new synthetic chemicals that are around the block? Well, it's
natural.
It's not just the natural, but that we've adapted to them. Our ancestors that didn't tolerate the potentially toxic chemicals in broccoli, they all died off a long time ago. So broccoli has pesticides in, natural pesticides called glucosinolates that are actually immune regulators. And theoretically, we should get sick when we eat broccoli. But our bodies have a genetically built-in tolerance to those chemicals, and actually we get benefits when we eat them. So that's what I'm saying. There's an evolutionary process that's going on here.
Right. And we want to stop whatever evolutionary process is happening with all this processed food and toxins and infections and all these things. So I love your new terminology of immune plasticity. So let's run with that. I normally, before we part ways, ask people what are 3 ways you could suggest to our listeners to take back their health. But I'm going to say 3 ways that they can improve their immune plasticity.
Yeah. Well, first of all, think of your immune cells as like any other cells in your body. They need basic nutrients. So I start with the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, and Z. I take a little jump there, but at minimum, people should take a good multivitamin that's got the B complex, C. Oh, and I didn't mention quercetin, which is another one of my favorites. So, you can start filling out the alphabet. It's just the basic nutrients that a lot of people are missing. Something as simple as taking vitamin A, which I know has been vilified, for being potentially toxic, but a lot of people need, the real vitamin A, not beta carotene, but real vitamin A. They need zinc, they need quercetin, so they need all of those things to keep their immune system healthy. Then they need to keep their gut microbiome healthy. And the best way to do that is with the prebiotic fibers, right? And all about that. So no need to go into a lot of detail about it, but, simple foods like eating artichokes and asparagus, whatever you can tolerate, those things are good. If you need the specialty fibers, the kiwi fruit extracts, those things are fine as well. So I do recommend a lot of prebiotics to my patients.
And I usually give the caveat of after you've treated your SIBO and your candida, load up on the prebiotics.
Go slow. People do get gas from it. There's 2 different approaches. One is to just blast your system and get through it. And some of my colleagues say, that's the way to go, 3 tablespoons a day. Well, I personally can't do it.
No.
Yeah, I can't do it. I'm a go slow kind of guy. So, and then the final thing is to use natural anti-inflammatory foods, as much organic extra virgin olive oil as you can get your hands on. I think there's really good data on that. I think omega-3 fatty acids are beneficial. I know that the cardiologists are saying, oh, this stuff will give you AFib, and, I don't get it. So, I think the healthy oils are pretty important as a part of that. And, that's 3 out of 100.
Yes.
I think
okay.
It's a good start.
A very good start. But you didn't even mention mushrooms in there. I guess you could have put that in the eating the anti-inflammatory diet.
Yeah, anti-inflammatory diet, the immune regulators, NAC, N-acetylcysteine, which I love. So again, that list could go on.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you already mentioned that you don't have a website, but how can people find you? You are still in clinical practice.
Yeah, so I'm not seeing new patients though. So that's why I train doctors. So that's what I love to do is teach doctors to do this because, if I teach a person to fish.
Absolutely.
Right. So the Institute for Functional Medicine, that's where I send people. They have a website and they list the doctors that are practicing the kind of medicine that I do. So that's really the stage I'm at in life is creating proteges that can take this information out to the world.
Well, we need a person just like you because there are not enough practitioners in the world to, see everybody who needs to be seen. So I appreciate everything that you do. And thanks for teaching me all those many years ago and teaching me today about mushrooms and teaching our listeners. So we appreciate it. And we'll just hope to, run into you at IFM or on the streets of Boulder, Colorado, I guess.
Yeah, or Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Yes, right. We can talk about that after we're done. Yes. Well, it was great to see you, and I appreciate your time today.
You betcha.
Take care. I want to thank this week's guests for sharing their time and knowledge, and thank you for listening. To read the full show notes for each episode, which include a summary, timestamp, quotes, and any resources mentioned, please visit amymyersmd.com/podcast. Lastly, if you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love if you would leave a rating and a review on Apple or Spotify, and we'll select a few to read out loud in a future episode. Tune in next week to hear from another inspiring guest as we help you take back your health.